Hi everyone, thanks so much for this chance to present at this conference. Can I just double check if you can hear me well and if you can see me? That's perfect. Thank you. And can you also see the slides? Okay, so let's start. An artist traveler Pelegrinus and his late 11th century Traditio Legis relief in Verona, Italy. A large collection of Romanesque sculpture at the Museo di Castelvecchio in Verona includes a relief notable for its rare iconography, style, and carved inscription with the signature of the maker, the sculptor Pelegrinus. In the 18th century, the relief was discovered by canon and antiquarian Giovanni Dionisi during refurbishments at Verona Cathedral. The earliest known source on Pelegrinus relief is Dionisi's Osservazioni. That's a treatise written in 1767. Historical evidence for the sculptor Pelegrinus and his work is lacking, and in this paper I emphasize that any attempt of identification should be made with caution. I suggest that the name Pelegrinus may be a pseudonym and that it strongly associates with traveling artists and cultural exchange. Firstly, in my presentation, I discussed the matters of sculptor's identity and literacy by using the relief signed by Pelegrinus as an example. And I suggest that carved inscriptions may be considered as sculptor's written self-representations. In addition, I propose a revision of the dating of the case study, which facilitates inquiries in this direction. Secondly, in my paper, I discuss and I present my careful translation of an 18th century Italian document about Pelegrinus, as well as the results of my study of biographies, registers, and of historical personalities who are known under the name of Pelegrinus. And this allows making hypotheses on the sculptor's origin and social background. The relief by Pelegrinus is shaped in the form of an arch and represents Christ, Saint Peter, and Saint Paul in an architectural setting. This iconography is known as the Traditio Legis. Christ holds an open book and makes a blessing gesture. Both apostles are easily identifiable by their names carved next to the images. Pelegrinus' inscription at the relief is devotional, but its author also expresses a concern for salvation. The sculptor Pelegrinus used the form ego in this inscription, which, in my opinion, is representative of such matter as artist's self-awareness. The inscription in the relief is an important as its figurative components as well. It begins with Christ's words in a band above the figures and continues over the semicircular arch. The next portion of the inscription is divided in two parts. Both appear at the bottom of the columns in the relief and convey a message from the sculptor Pelegrinus. And in this inscription, the sculptor calls himself a pilgrim and asks God for a place in heaven. The name Pelegrinus is of Latin origin and literally means a pilgrim, a traveler, or a person from a foreign country. It accurately reflects the artist's activities and that he often had to travel for commissions. In any case, this name assumes either a metaphorical pilgrimage through life or the one from life on earth to heavenly Jerusalem. Pelegrinus' inscription is a question on the degree of his literacy have hardly been subjects of discussion in old scholarship. However, recently, this long inscription was compared to a poem written in Leonine hexameter. And the maker of this relief masterly achieved technical and conceptual connections between the inscriptions and figurative elements. This, I suggest, could support an argument that the sculptor may have possessed at least basic level of literacy sufficient to understand Latin and carve inscriptions. For instance, the same drilling technique that was used to depict apostles' halos and the pupils of their eyes was applied for the letters in the inscription. This may indicate that no other professional was appointed to work specifically on the inscription. The drilling technique ensured accuracy when carving the letters and created a specific decorative effect of the paleographical characters. In Pelegrinus relief, this feature is consistent and the division between the words is accurate. Nevertheless, the link between the inscription and the figures in the relief demonstrates that Pelegrinus executed the work but may not serve as direct evidence for the sculptor's literacy. It is essential to be cautious when assuming that Pelegrinus may have composed the inscription without additional help, because detailed documentary evidence on the sculptor's background is missing. In my PhD thesis, I discussed this issue and underlined that, in fact, it is uncertain to what extent sculptors were responsible for designs and texts of their inscriptions. Recent scholarship suggested that abilities to read and write were not necessary for sculptors who may have simply copied the letters from the text or used templates to make inscriptions. However, knowledge on this subject remains fragmentary to date. The case that sculptors use text or templates for copying may not exclude their literacy, or at least semi-literacy, and ability to make these templates themselves. And I also mentioned in my thesis that medieval sculptors may have been the authors of inscriptions included in their works. Some of them may have followed the inscriptions and instructions of educated patrons or their advisors. However, documented cases proving otherwise exist and were presented in scholarship. For instance, a monk from St. Gall, Tuitilo, was a sculptor, a painter, and a musician, and also he decorated his works with various inscriptions. The high quality of execution, rather small spaces between the letters, and correct division between the words may indicate that the carver of the inscription at the Traditio Legis relief understood Latin. The possibility that, similar to the monk at St. Gall, Pelegrinus may have been literate enough to compose written self-representations could not be excluded. Besides, Verona, with its cultural atmosphere of the center of rhetoric and poetry, was a favorable place for enhancement of literacy. However, I suggest that the question whether the maker of the inscription at the Traditio Legis relief had knowledge of Latin or was an illiterate copyist should remain open for discussion, as giving a definitive answer is hardly possible. Due to the lack of documentary evidence on the sculptor Pelegrinus, I worked with various sources and historical documents in the course of my research. This at least allows making hypotheses on the identity of Pelegrinus. Giovanni Dionisi considered the Traditio Legis relief as a valuable piece produced by the maker of Italian origin, probably from Verona or its countryside. This assumption was made by the author as a result of his thorough research in an attempt to identify the sculptor. And in my PhD thesis, I continued studies on the matter of Pelegrinus' identity, building upon my thorough translations from Dionisi's treatise, which is called Osservazioni sopra un'antica cristiana scultura ritrovata nel recinto della Cattedrale di Verona, in which the author shares the results of his search in Veronese archives. This is particularly valuable because at present, many archival documents on medieval Verona are lost. In fact, Dionisi succeeded to find several Pelegrinus namesakes. The author noted that early 11th century sources on the Guild of Notaries included evidence on a man of noble activities by the name Pelegrinus, who played an important role in the city government and was involved and notarial concerns of the church. Dionysi also referred to the man Peregrinum Teutonicum di Civitate Verona, which indicates that he was probably a person of Germanic origin residing in Italian Verona. The author specified the name Pelegrinus was common at those times and suggested that all the namesakes may have descended from the same family line. Further, the antiquarian wrote that the documents dated after 1100 referred to numerous personalities with the same name, Pelegrinus, often abbots or monks. Among them, Dionysi noted Maestro Alberto, probably Pelegrinus' son or descendant. As the inscription in Verona Cathedral says, Alberto was the main priest and the bishop, and died in 1231. Thus, despite certain chronological and documentary discrepancies, Dionysi attempted reconstructing a genealogical tree of Pelegrinus' family and assumed that the earliest of them was the sculptor and the maker of the Traditio Legis relief. However, archival documents that were available to Dionysi gave no direct evidence on Pelegrinus, who was proficient in arts and sculpting. In fact, nothing is known about life and work of the sculptor Pelegrinus, and the signed relief at the Museo di Castelvecchio seems to be the only surviving evidence on the sculptor's existence. This suggests investigating whether Pelegrinus may have been a traveling sculptor who worked in Verona by invitation and thus was not mentioned in the archives as a citizen. In the course of my research, I have collected more evidence for an identification of the sculptor Pelegrinus, and I would like to present the results of a thorough search through several biographical indexes and volumes compiling medieval historical documents. These sources contain biographical references on saints, bishops, and philosophers named Pelegrinus, with variations of this name, who were active approximately between the 1st and the 16th centuries. Notably, one of these volumes had a record on a sculptor. And one recent biographical index of medieval personalities published in 2010 briefly mentioned the sculptor Pelegrinus, redirecting the readers to an earlier source by Thema Baker, which in turn provided facts of common knowledge and outdated references. Notably, among the namesake artists listed by Thema Baker, Pelegrinus was the only 12th century sculptor. The search in the biographical indexes revealed that quite often the name Pelegrinus was used as a pseudonym in addition to an actual name, which may be the reason why identifying the maker of the Traditio Legis relief is so difficult. This observation encouraged a broader search for hypothetical identifications with personalities who are active in various fields, including arts, and known under this pseudonym. Among the 95,000 people listed in biographical indexes of medieval names, there are several dozens of persons named Pelegrinus, including Christian saints, hermits, and ecclesiastics, artists, philosophers, and historians from France, Italy, and Germany. Among all these personalities, my attention was caught by one Benedictine monk from Germany, Konrad von Hirsau, and he was the only 12th century Pelegrinus who met the criteria of my search in biographical dictionaries and indexes. However, there is no documentary evidence that he visited Verona and was proficient in sculpting. I have also thoroughly reviewed information on personalities who were active in medieval Verona at that period under the name Pelegrinus, and questioned whether one of these persons may be identified as the sculptor. Historical documents indicated that among the numerous members of clergy, Magister Pellegrini, the chaplain of the Apostolic Legate, attended a sumptuous ceremony at Verona Cathedral in August 1193. However, previous scholarship noted that this source absolutely excludes Dionysius' identification of this Pellegrini with the Pellegrini who sculpted the fragment of the church furniture. Indeed, the style of Pelegrinus relief, its iconography, and certain features of the inscription show that it was created much earlier than 1193, when the chaplain was active. And another namesake was possible contemporary of the sculptor, that's Pelegrinus I, the patriarch in northern Italy, between 1130 and 1161. However, no evidence of his artistic activities survives, and he was primarily responsible for important political and religious decisions and consecrations of churches. Thus, the attempts to draw parallels between the sculptor Pelegrinus and his other namesakes have not shown convincing results. For instance, there is no sufficient evidence to establish any connection between the sculptor Pelegrinus and the noble family Pellegrini recorded in the late 14th century in the area called Pellegrina, currently related to the commune Isola della Scala, the province of Verona. An identification of Pelegrinus with Pellegrino de Porto from Mantova, an architect active in the last quarter of the 15th century, is also unlikely due to the chronological discrepancy. I would also like to underline another source in my studies, the treatise Notizie Storici delle Chiese di Verona. This treatise mentioned the name Pellegrino, an Italian variant of the Latin name Pellegrinus, mentioned it several times in relation to the history of churches situated in close proximity to Verona. However, it is uncertain from the text whether it implied only one person or several namesakes who were active in the first half of the 12th century. In each case, it is a representative of Veronese religious community who possessed sufficient authority. For instance, the name of the abbot at the monastery of Santi Pietro e Vito di Calaverna, close to Trento, was Pellegrino. The location of this monastery close to the Alps and German-speaking territories determined that the monks there were of Germanic origin, as it is seen from their names mentioned in documents from around 1145. The absence of further evidence on this person, however, again, would not allow associating him with the sculptor Pelegrinus. Among all the sculptor's namesakes, a cleric or priest, Pelegrinus, who worked with the Veronese bishop Bernardo, deserves a closer investigation. Together, they conveyed reforms of morals among the clergy and significantly contributed to restorations of churches and ecclesiastical heritage in Verona after the earthquake of 1117. Scholarship stated that the structure of San Giovanni in Valle was erected already in 1120 and convincingly suggested an attribution of certain interior and exterior sculptures to the maker of the Traditio Legis relief. In 1127, the Bishop Bernardo invited a secular priest Pellegrino and several canons regular who followed the rule of St. Augustine to reform the Benedictine monastery San Giorgio in Brida, which entered the state of spiritual degradation as the monks led dissolute lives. Historical sources and recent scholarship provided little evidence on this person, but noted that in addition to reforms, he was supposed to restore the buildings in San Giorgio in Brida. Thus, this secular priest also demonstrated competence as an architect and a sculptor. I consider that it may have been the same Pelegrinus who earlier assisted the Bishop Bernardo at San Giovanni in Valle, and whose work there reveals strong stylistic affinities to the Traditio Legis relief. The period of his work at San Giovanni in Valle and his involvement in reconstruction of other churches in Verona coincide. Hypothetically, this identification is possible. Moreover, the ecclesiastic background of this Bishop Bernardo's assistant suggests literacy, which may have been sufficient to compose an inscription. Comparisons between sculpture from San Giorgio in Brida and San Giovanni in Valle and the Traditio Legis relief would have strengthened the argument, of course. However, in the 16th century, San Giorgio in Brida was largely rebuilt, and its bell tower, the only surviving 12th century construction, has not retained any specific sculptural decoration. The documents mentioning the secular priest Pellegrino have not specified from where he was invited to Verona by the Bishop Bernardo, and the name Pellegrino indeed suggests this person was a traveler and had to overcome distances, both geographical and cultural, to settle in Italy. Pelegrinus is the name of Latin origin and translates as a pilgrim, a traveler, or a person from a foreign country. It was used by the Romans to distinguish people who were not the citizens of Rome. And in relation to artists, this name accurately reflects that sometimes they traveled for commissions. Indeed, the name Pelegrinus in the relief also assumes a pilgrimage, and it could be either a metaphorical pilgrimage through life or the one from life on earth to heavenly Jerusalem. I suggest the words sum Pelegrinus ego in the sculptor's signature may be taken literally. The name Pelegrinus may have been a pseudonym which fully corresponds to the sculptor's intention to express humility by concealing his real name and calling himself a pilgrim. In the medieval period, undertaking a pilgrimage and traveling in general was dangerous. Thus, it is understandable why the sculptor may have wanted to emphasize that he conveyed a pilgrimage in his life and that he was a pilgrim, yet he wanted to conceal his name, and he achieved it in a humble way. To conclude, my studies of early sources and translations reveal that Pelegrinus was active in Verona in circa 1100s. From the 18th century treatise based on earlier documents on early Veronese archives, I suggest that he may have been of Germanic origin. He was definitely a person of various attainments, but the question about his social status and position within church hierarchy is still left open due to the lack of firm documentary evidence. Nevertheless, the carved inscription of Pelegrinus reveals interesting aspects about the sculptor's identity and personality. These words of the inscription perpetuated the memory of Pelegrinus throughout the centuries, and they serve as his self-representation until present days. Thank you for your attention.